Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I am joined today by the great David Lyle Jeffrey, much beloved around here. He is Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Literature and the Humanities at Baylor University. Jeffrey earned his PhD from Princeton University and is the author or editor of many books, many with Baylor University Press, including Houses of the Interpreter, The King James Bible and the World It Made, We Were a Peculiar People Once, Art Seeking Understanding, but most recently, and what we're here to talk about today, is this children's book, Tales from Limerick Forest. So thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to enjoy, I think, conversing with people about a book that's right out of the ballpark for me. Children's literature is not what anybody would have expected from me given my career.
Sure, yeah. And that's actually what I want to ask. I mean, so you are a medievalist, you're a scholar of biblical literature, a scholar of Western literature and art. And so your career has ranged pretty broadly within those categories, but has not yet included a children's book. So explain to me, how do you get from, let's just pick one of these, We Were a Peculiar People Once, Confessions of an Old-Time Baptist. How do you get from a book like that to this book, Tales from Limerick Forest, which is a children's book?
Okay, well, part of the reason we'll be having 10 grandchildren.
Okay.
If you have grandchildren, you find yourself telling them stories. In fact, their parents will tell the grandchildren when the story varies from the one they remember. You're telling them.
Yeah.
But, storytelling is a very important part, I think, of Christian culture. And the church I grew up in was, working class people, Scottish Baptists, but everybody had books. Everybody read books. My grandmother had probably 1,000 books in her shelves on 3 floors of that old rickety house. and you were allowed to read as kids. And I wouldn't be, singular in this regard. You were allowed to have any book in the house and read it. So at a very early age, I read some Shakespeare, some Dickens, some Walter Scott. I also read some books that my grandfather prized, having to do with the Arctic explorations. Right.
Yeah. So emerging then out of this kind of biographical sense of the importance of storytelling within your own family, right? And now you have grandkids. And so am I right? Did these emerge from actual stories that you told your own grandchildren?
They're all actual stories I told my own grandchildren. And a couple of them are stories that I told to their parents, or one of their parents, obviously. When they were small. So, yeah, it's a family thing.
So it's a family thing, but a family thing that I think is going to be a blessing to lots of families and not just to your own. So tell me a little bit about the kind of concept behind the book. It is a collection of stories, but these aren't just sort of stories haphazardly told purely for the sake of entertainment. There's a lot more going on here. So what are some of the kind of conceptual background of this book?
Well, to put this in a somewhat academic way, there's a man named Walter Benjamin who died in the 40s, European critic who wrote a wonderful essay about storytelling. It's called The Storyteller. And what he says that the storyteller tries to do is to impart a counsel of wisdom. Now, this is, I think, what parents and grandparents do, consciously or unconsciously, when they choose stories over other stories to tell their kids. There are some that are just entertainment, or some just madcap crazy. And I've told a few of those to my kids too. But, what characterizes most of these stories and what provides them a kind of cycle shape of the seasons and so on is the problems, the encounters with reality that kids will have from an early age as they mature. I mean, these first stories, I told them to my granddaughter when she was 7 and 8, and then right on up till the time she's 11.
Right. So there is a sense here in which on one hand, these are kind of morality tales, that there are lessons to be learned here. But one of the things that I appreciate about this book as I was reading it with my own 6-year-old was that it's not just sort of, the moral of the story is not just, hey, don't hit your sister or don't take your friend's ball. Like those are important lessons to learn, but there's actually a lot more kind of subtlety and nuance going on here. I think about the story about temperance and the living within one's limits and the effects that actually has on those around us. And I wonder if you could take me in a little bit into how this is a kind of an exposition of what you might call natural law theory. How does that play a role in this book?
Well, it has been remarked by a reviewer that this is a textbook on natural law.
Okay.
And in a way it is. One of the things that seems to me growing up where I did in the rather remote Canadian wilderness, 7 miles from a neighbor, I spent a lot of time observing animals, observing nature, living in nature, and it formed me very much as a young guy. And I began to notice things that you would expect a person to notice. The wonderful order of creation, the way in which things work, the way in which there is a reality out there, which is a truth and consequences reality, right? And so as a child, I mean, you do learn not to take certain risks, the hard way or the easy way, you learn it. And what I wanted to communicate, without being, how shall I put it, condescending in any way, I wanted to communicate how a child might see that, and working through the perspective of animals is a good way to avoid the kind of thing you were talking with your sister,
Yeah. Right.
And so that's what I did.
Yeah. And there is this lovely kind of seasonality to it. And it really is rooted in the real life experience of nature. And I think that's an important distinction to make here. These aren't animals living human lives. These are animals living animal lives. And so could you talk about kind of the realism of the book for a minute?
Sure. Well, everything the animals do in Tales from Limerick Forest are what animals do. There are no sort of, it's not like a little kind of a cartoon where the animal will do what people do, In fact, the animals are kind of wary of people.
Yeah.
You say so. They call them people creatures, and they think it's on the whole best to stay away from those guys.
Yeah.
But the animals here are observing natural cycles. So, the snowy owls really do migrate south. I've seen one right here in Texas.
Oh, really?
If the lemmings are too deep in the snow, they come down and eat red squirrels.
Oh, okay.
And it's also true that
I've got a few squirrels in my backyard they're welcome to have. If you send them my way, please.
Yeah, well, a lot of folks feel that way. But if you consider things about the beaver, what the beaver does, how he lives, if you consider things about the life cycles of everything from foxes to raccoons and so on, all of that stuff is literal, right? I mean, raccoons do love to get as many berries as they can get, and the foxes don't like it if they get there first.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So that's just part of reality.
Yeah. And there's also a sense in which you're kind of not sugarcoating reality in the book, right? So animals die and are eaten by other animals. And that's actually plays a significant role in the development of this little animal community, right? So could you talk a little bit about the importance of keeping that as real as possible?
Yeah, I think one of the things that some kinds of kid stories do that is not good for kids is to pretend that there is no suffering, to pretend that there is no death, and also to kind of gloss over the fact that some animals eat meat.
Right.
That's just part of the reality too.
Yeah.
So that scene, that story in which the Limerick Forest Rules of Laws, that chapter is called, in which the owls are asked to adjudicate between the meat eaters and the herbivores.
Right.
And what they say is, you'll all recognize that some creatures only eat meat. Some creatures only eat herbs.
Yeah.
And the buck says, he says, well, it'd be a wonderful world if everybody was just like us and ate only herbs. But that's not the real world. The real world is a balance.
Yeah.
And there's a relationship between all the creatures that makes of them a kind of harmony in creation.
Yeah. Yeah. Take us into then a couple of these characters. So you mentioned these owls, and the owls have a particular role to play in the community. There's a porcupine, and he has a particular role to play. The deer. Could you talk to us about just a couple of these key characters and their personality traits and how they fit within the community?
Sure. Prickly porcupine, which some of my grandchildren have thought was based upon their grandfather, is a person who tends to be very concerned with people getting it. Right. It's kind of got a teacherly style, in short. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so what he does is he lives a kind of a solitary life. He's a bachelor, and his buddy, the raven, also is a kind of a bachelor guy. And they're both sort of on the fringes of society, but looking in and observing and observing and observing. Right.
Yeah.
And it's the case that Blackstone Raven, otherwise known as Moses, is a commentator on the law. Now, if you're the dad reading this, you may remember that when you were an undergraduate, there was this guy named Blackstone who wrote commentaries on the English common law. Right? If you were a person who had a certain kind of background, you might remember that Maitland was the great exponent of English common law, F.W. Maitland. So I'm sneaking in things there for mom and dad to develop if they choose. It's there if they want it.
Yeah.
They don't have to do anything with it.
Right. So you've got the porcupine, and then you have this raven, and you have these kind of Easter eggs hidden throughout for the more let the reader understand kind of moments, right? And so tell me about the deer. Who is the deer and his role in the story?
Braveheart Buck is and his mate Dora and their little fawn Daisy. They are typical of those animals which have a certain kind of appeal to us for their beauty, for their elegance. I mean, you ever watch deer just jumping over the fence one after the other? Wings.
Yes.
We look at this and we admire them, and yet at the same time we recognize that they are very vulnerable creatures. Do vulnerable creatures ever, try to defend their own? Act in a way that any human dad might want to act.
Yeah.
And that's what Braveheart Buck does, right?
Yeah.
He sees the danger, and it's extreme risk to himself. If he doesn't get those antlers in the right spot, he loses his throat, right?
Yeah.
So, what I'm doing with him is I'm giving the kids a model, and Dora and Daisy, I'm giving them a model of a gentle life. That nevertheless is strong.
Yeah, there is a great gentleness and strength to that family in particular. And one of my favorite moments in the book, it's the closest the book ever comes towards any kind of explicitly religious kind of moment. And that's where it's Christmas time and they're observing these human creatures doing Christmas things, but they don't understand it, the animals never cross that boundary, they sort of are looking on the inside kind of perplexed, but there's this, Braveheart Buck, he's explaining the humans in this time of season. And he talks about the kind of sense of reverence and the sense of joy that the humans seem to have. But without any real knowledge. But then the animals at the end turn toward the northern lights and they see these northern lights and there's this moment of wonder that they experience together. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the dynamics of that scene, because there's just a lot going on there. How does that fit into your overall vision for the book?
Well, very much it's pertinent to the final message that I would like to leave with people. When they look up and they see the northern lights, you remember that one of the creatures is asked, namely Prickly, what's going on here? Prickly says, I think those are the most amazing northern lights I've ever seen. What are northern lights? And he said, well, maybe it's deep heaven singing.
Yeah.
Well, that's what should prompt a question from the child who's being read to. What does it mean, Dad? Deep heaven is singing. And how does that be in the same story with the people going to church that don't understand, and, and they're singing? And what about singing season? What is that about,
Yeah.
So what I want the book to do is to prompt the right sort of questions from a child
Yeah.
to discuss with mom, dad, or grandparents.
Mm.
And I myself, I don't know if you've ever seen the Northern Lights. The Aurora Borealis, where I come from, is much more frequent than it is down here. We don't see it very often down here.
Yeah.
But it is one of the truly most mysterious things in all of creation. And I've been, sitting inside, near the stove on a winter's night, and I heard the Northern Lights. That is to say, a kind of a high, sound, and ran outside, and there's these billowy curtains of, magenta and green and gold.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Wow. So it's a way in which we see that the glory of God, if we wanted to put it in theological terms, is displayed in his creation.
Yeah.
And every time we see it, and I think anything like that, it creates in us a sense of wonder.
Yeah.
And that's what you want kids to go away from. Not that they got a package, they understand everything's pat and done. No. A sense of wonder that can be explored forever. And that is a theological thing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember as a kid, my mother reading George MacDonald to me. And it was that I remember he really would capture that sense of wonder, in a very profound way.
Yep.
And the process of hearing those stories, I think, is very formative, even in a way that I probably couldn't express. It shapes you in very deep ways. So could you talk to us about the importance of the mode of the story itself? Like, how does that shape us as human beings, in particular children? Why do kids need stories?
Well, this may or may not get at your own experience with George MacDonald, who was a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, of course. But I think you mentioned that your mother read them to you. And I think the story heard is more powerful than the story read. I think that there is something in the mediation of the human voice, especially if someone who you're close to. We know, for example, that parents who read to their children have a profound bonding experience with those children that does not occur in parents that don't read to their children. And when they read to them things that, as it were, awaken wonder, and it, that stirs the mind of a child. It keeps in the mind of a child. Chances are that you remember this experience with your mom and George MacDonald, in a way that you don't remember every experience. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that, all of us who participate in the life of the story, and certainly true of my own childhood as well, have benefited from the reading, not just as a matter of reading facts or reading fiction, but it's actually an experience of entering into an imaginative world. And when you enter into that imaginative world, all kinds of things become possible.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, we talked about the realism of the book, which is very much true. They're based in a real world that has real consequences and what you might call a real moral universe, right? That these animals are trying to navigate. At the same time, the animals do things that animals don't do. They speak to each other. They speak in apparently English, and they also they share insights with one another, and they share insights with us. And so there is, at the same time, you have a very imaginative world that is nonetheless grounded in reality, right? And I suppose that's what makes it a kind of morality tale in the classical sense. Maybe not so much in the kind of finger wagging sense that you.
Yeah, well, Aesop's fables would come to mind for some people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. The idea that animals speak to each other is one that's been with me since I was a child. I once looked over the corral, and there were some chickens pecking around there, and I was thinking, I don't know, but I'm wondering, because they're cluck, cluck, cluck. I'm wondering what they're communicating to each other. It might be maybe 8 or 9 or something. But I said, all of a sudden it occurred to me, the cows don't wonder. We who are human wonder. about
Mm.
communication. Now, we do know that, some animals do understand each other's communication. For example, if the crows are going crazy and going caw, 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 and there's a whole bunch of them, look for the owl that they're driving nuts.
Okay.
Because that's a certain sign that's going on.
Yes. Yeah.
So what would you do with that? Well, if you want to make a story, it's imaginative. And other people have done this much better than I, Wynland and Willis.
Mm.
You allow the animals to communicate with each other as proxies,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And they don't become proxies for the author or even the reader so much as for the children who's listening to the story.
Mm.
Because you can identify with some of these animals.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think the average kid will identify with smelling the skunk. But the chances of identifying with Charlie, the chipmunk,
Mm-hmm.
who nearly gets taken away forever.
Yes. Yeah.
And who has the problem of going back and admitting to his mother that he didn't pay attention to what he told him. I mean, that gets right there to where kids live. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And so you mentioned Charlie the chipmunk, and there is a lovely drawing or a lovely image in the book done by the artist, and she did a fantastic job with the images in the book. And so I want to talk to us a little bit about your partnership with her and how she contributed to the book.
Sure. Megan Major lives in Clifton, or very near Clifton. Ran a little art studio there for a number of years, and she painted. If you're in Clifton, you'll notice that there are these kind of boards painted with the caricature likeness of the owner of a store.
Mm.
There are 54 of those all around.
Oh, wow.
Clifton, and she did them all. And she's able to make these people into trolls. So they look like trolls, because it's a very Norwegian community.
Okay.
They look like trolls, but you can actually tell, no, that looks like a troll, but that's actually Philip Reiser. I know who that is.
Okay. Yeah.
Of course, it's in front of that restaurant.
Mm.
So I was looking at these one day, and I said, I think this lady has the capacity. I'll see what she thinks. So she read the book. She said, I would love to do this. So she did some illustrations for me, just trial illustrations. And I thought, bingo, you have got the job.
Okay. That's great. And I know from our team here that she's just lovely to work with. And did a fantastic job on the book. And even from a production standpoint here was super helpful at getting the book through. So many thanks to Megan Major. And you should all go look up Megan Major art and from Clifton, Texas, which is a beautiful little town right outside of Waco. Lovely hills going down to the river and the lake there. So Megan Major art, definitely check her out. I do know that she is online, so she can be found there. This is a kind of multidimensional work then, because you have this story with these animals, which has a really beautiful and nuanced kind of intellectual background to it. And then you have the artwork by Megan. And then interspersed throughout here is poetry. So we've sort of hit all of the, story, poetry, art. It's all included here. So talk about the limericks first. So every story is punctuated by a limerick. So tell us how that functions and why you chose to end the stories that way.
Yeah, well, the original function and purpose of poetry and pre-literate societies was to be the community memory, right? So in that sense, Prickly, the porcupine, is like an early poet. And for a child, limericks are the easiest to remember and to relate to, right? Because of this very predictable little rhyme pattern. They're short too.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. But Prickly is a poet, but he's not a very good poet. And that's part of the fun, right?
Yeah.
And so, people have different ideas about the virtue of his poetry. But the reason why we have the bard poet, the bard owl at the end, not B-A-R-R-E-D, but B-A-R-D,
Yeah.
like the bard, he comes in, he's a higher grade of poet.
Right?
So
Yeah.
Prickly records what happened. The bard owl gives us a sense of why.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So right at the end, we're introduced here to the barred owl, and the barred owl appears and he shares a poem that it's not a limerick. It's much more developed than a limerick, and it's much more mysterious as a poem. There's a kind of a depth to it that is not always there in Prickly's limericks. And so talk to us a little bit about this poem and the role that it plays in the story.
Okay, well, the poem is in a way an introduction for children to the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, which are something that, people thinking about the order of creation, the order of human life and all life have thought about, for maybe 3,000 years at least.
Yes, yeah.
And so in a way, it's a way of drawing their attention to the fact that the things we regard as wonderfully true and wonderfully good and also beautiful are gifts of creation, right? And that's the context in which I think that poem is to be understood. And of course, as you remember, after they've heard it, they're all kind of dropped into silence, and Prickly is asked, well, what are you going to do about that one, And he wisely says, no, I think we'll just let that be the final word.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a beautiful part, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading this poem for us to give our listeners a chance to taste the end of the book.
Sure. Well, you'll notice, those of you who read the book, that there's kind of a lame poem that the barred owl tries to say first, and they shut him down. The owls, and the crows all think it's garbage. But then he says he'll recite a traditional poem. He calls it the Anthem of the Deep Forest. And he says, I didn't write this. It's been handed down for generations, and I don't know whether it was composed by a barred owl. That's what the moose think. That's what the bears think. But here it is. It's not by me, but it's something which we call the Deep Forest Anthem. When starry skies above tall trees turn daylight dazzle through the leaves, all creatures look, and each one sees. All nature's ways are patterned true. Each day the earth yields wholesome food, whatever season, time, or mood. So all may flourish, none exclude. Our needs are met, fulfilled of good. All and more than this, our senses tell of joyful pleasures, touch and smell, in such abundance, wrought so well, they're altogether beautiful. In various voices, thus we sing. Our songs make field and forest ring.
That's lovely. Yeah, thank you for writing that and for sharing that with us. There is, as you said, what I really loved about that poem is the part where the bard in the beginning says, I didn't write this. I inherited this, and I pass it on to you. And there is a sense here in which I think because of your background as a scholar of literature and theology and art, that you are attempting here to transmit something, right? So this isn't just David Lyle Jeffrey's opinions on the world, but you're really trying to channel a long tradition into the minds and hearts of children and their parents. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing to do. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for writing this delightful children's book. You can pick up Tales from Limerick Forest at baylorpress.com. You can pick it up today, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you.
You are welcome. Thank you very much, Joshua.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.